I discussed that to get into my topic, which I've been hesitant to bring up here. Aleksei Losev, who was one of the major, if not the major, 20th century Russian religious philosopher. Almost nothing is in English of his. That's no accident. The things that are in English, a few of the big journals have run issues dedicated to him. But the problem is that they're mostly translated from other languages. And so they're not very good, only because the translations are problematic. The translator may not have realized the technical definition, that they're using terms like will or understanding or concept or idea in a technical way, in a Hegelian way. If you don't know that, you're going to translate that maybe as something similar. So it's almost impossible to read. Hegel uses and Kant uses these terms in a very, very specific way. You have to know their system first. But a translator may not know that. And so when they're putting these things together, it sounds very awkward because they're translating literally using conversational definitions of terms like that, and you have to start reading between the lines. So in Losev's case, I read nothing in English. I went to the original, which is extremely difficult. And the reason I was hesitant to bring him up is because he's primarily a metaphysician. He sought out to create at least the foundations of a Russian Orthodox philosophy, to bring the patristic world into the same world as modern philosophy, at least in the sense that we're using the same language, and we're realizing that certain concepts from Hegel's philosophy in particular, or Schelling, or Husserl, people like that, are actually usable. That some of the insights of Hegel, for example, is very useful to make sense out of the ancients, and that's true. And so what he's doing is very foundational. He lives in the Soviet era. He was arrested several times. He went to a labor camp. He knew powerful people, and he stayed. He never went into exile. He died in the 80s, and it's very odd that he's promoting a very, very orthodox worldview. And although he did spend time in a labor camp, he seemed to know people that kept him safe. Or maybe they just didn't think that he was worth it. In fact, he won a state prize for philosophy near his death. I believe it was 85. Losev is very difficult, as any Hegelian will be. I'm realizing that one of the great strengths I have in coming into the Russian Orthodox world is that I spent years upon years poring over Hegel. Plato and Hegel should be taken care of together. But Hegel is very daunting. Hegelians don't know what he's talking about most of the time. And you have to be very, very patient. Unfortunately, the 19th century and 20th century Russian mission is being laid out in Hegelian terms. The Slavophiles in particular are using Hegelian terms. They're not using it. They're not copying it. They have no interest in importing that stuff here. That was the language of philosophy, and so they use it. There's a very fine line there. When I first read Hegel, I realized that he was extremely valuable. That he was a Christian man, and it's very usable in laying out a foundational Orthodox philosophy. And slowly but surely it dawned on me. And of course, his philosophy of right was a subject. My master's thesis was on the philosophy of right. One of the greatest works of conservatism, in the true sense, ever written. Because it's so inaccessible, it doesn't get treated as such. Karl Marx, often is seen as a protege, which is ridiculous. They didn't have much in common. Marx primarily came from Feuerbach and Hess and that movement, rather than Hegel, who had died, quite a bit before. Marx's doctoral dissertation was on Lucretius and the materialists of the pre-Socratic era. So it's a problem when you're reading Losev or anyone like him. You have to know your Hegel very, very well, and therefore you have to know your Kant very, very well. And if you don't, you're going to sound foolish. And so there's a lot of assumptions that when you write this kind of philosophy, you're laying out foundations. You're not talking about arguments in favor of the faith. You're talking about what would constitute proof in the first place, what would constitute evidence, or how would cognition go when you're discussing these things. He's known for several things, and he's just, I think he's not known in the West because he's very good. Philosophers known in the West are just guys who play word games and the useless characters like that, the analytic nonsense, that morass has destroyed philosophy for most people. The real philosophers around the world remain unread and unknown. He used Hegelian language. He spoke of primarily metaphysics, and he's extremely convincing to those who know the language. Like everything else, you need someone who knows the material to slowly enculturate you into the thing. You can't just pick up a book. That's not how it works. You have to know everything he says before you know anything he says. And because he's using words in a very specific way. One of the main axioms, and I think is almost irrefutable, is that for there to be any multiplicity, there has to be unity first. There has to be a singularity before we can even talk about something coming from that, a multiplicity. So anytime there is a group of things that we can organize into a set, the assumption is that there's something from which they come that gives them that quality by which we can organize them. One of his main terms, used very technically, is myth. The concept of myth is one of these words that has lost all sense of its original meaning. A myth is something very, very good, very, very true. It is not a lie. It is not storytelling in the sense that we use the term. It's something true. I've said and will continue to say that the stories of the gods and goddesses of Egypt or Greece and Rome were never meant to be believed. They're not real people. They were not meant to be seen that way. Hesiod didn't think that he was Muhammad, receiving revelation from on high. He was just writing down stories. It was the best way, and an effective way, of encoding knowledge. The constitution of these societies could be found in the stories of these gods and goddesses, and that's why they were civic events. They would have feasts, and the plays, or the great plays that would talk about their deeds and their human proteges on earth, were civic events, political events. They were times of catharsis. The word religion is overused. The word God is overused. These were archetypes in the broad sense. Any act in Losev's mind has to come from a sense of self. I stated that to understand anything Losev says, you have to know everything he said. Which is paradoxical, because that's not how we learn. So you're talking about immersion and induction or initiation, rather than just a linear study of concepts. And that's the case for Hegel as well. What we have, when we perceive something, and this is the case in Russian philosophy all over the place, when we perceive something, we're deliberately focusing our attention on an object, an arbitrary object. I mean, we're not, we're separating it out from other objects because we need to. Our brain, though, is aware of a massive amount of material that it has to block out. There's no getting out of that. And even when we look at an object, we realize that we're only looking at a little piece of it, an aspect of it that's appealing to us, that we need at the moment. But the primary work of the brain in this case is to block out everything else around it. Any action, any move that we make of any kind, especially the things of social or civic importance, implies that we're doing this from a very strong foundation. It's not an arbitrary action. And the ultimate foundation for all things, the unity from which everything else comes, is myth. The best way to put it is that myth is the meta-reality. It's even broader than Dasein and Heidegger. Myth is the background of our day-to-day life, such that we can interpret our own acts and those of others and make sense out of them. It's a set of stories that have a lot in common, that are told in one form or another, that make a society a society. These are the things that bind people together in all forms, and not just politically. It's in every way. Our understanding of even basic argument. How do we make a philosophical argument? What constitutes proof? How do we know if we're thinking or feeling? These kind of questions are ultimately found in the foundation. You can't have anything. Nothing is beyond myth, because it would be a contradiction. You couldn't even conceive of it. Myth is that which makes any action possible. It's deeper than any set of institutions. It's deeper than any set of ideas. Like everything of value, it can't be written down. 99% of it is impossible to write down, or if you could, it would be volumes and volumes for the smallest thing. This means, though, that all that we see is interconnected. That we are arbitrary. We single out an object, and a part of an object with being arbitrary. There's nothing special about one aspect of matter that we call a name versus other things right next to it. We differentiate one thing from another because we need to. Ultimately, our brain sees, especially in our state, reality as just this flux of images and ideas. We kind of pin down reality and definition for that reason. We take a little chunk out of this huge flux of things that we see every day, and we give it a name because it's useful to us. Subject and object end up being the same thing. Reality is that which human beings project onto this flux. That means the world that we see is different compared, depending on our moral state. This is a central concept in Orthodox philosophy of any kind. There is no given. Well, there is in reality, but we don't know that. The way that we live our lives, the assumptions that we make, are always projected onto everything around us. And we give it a certain color. So little children don't see the world the way we do. Saints certainly do not. They see more of it. One of the central ideas in Losev is that the purpose of dialectic it's not about negation of some thesis. I'm afraid Hegel never even used that terminology. Dialectics is about taking an object and showing what it is in its entirety, as well as its connections to everything else. Any object you could take in your hand. You just take a soda can. Well, analyzing it, you see that the geometry is used everywhere. These proportions are exact. And so you have the history of mathematics and how we view the world right there. And then metalwork, aluminum. We're talking about international trade and bauxite. We're talking about how the methods of metalworking have developed over the centuries. We're talking about mass production. Then we have to talk about how the can is painted. It's designed to tease the eye. We go on and on and on. Every little bit has a tremendous history. You can tell the story of the entire world in a soda can, because every aspect of it is a result of some very deeply, very old historical process. You couldn't make these perfect circles that we have in the top unless you had this, a tremendous ability to create standardized production techniques. So philosophy, right down to any object we may see, is intensely historical and intensely social. Sometimes Losev will use the term absolute. He's not using it in a Hegelian sense. He's referring to myth. There can be nothing beyond it. Myth is the ultimate reality as far as our human nature is concerned. God revealed himself in the Old Testament to a group of people that already existed. He adapted, so to speak, to the culture that they were in, and continued to do so. Continued to speak to them, and including in the New Testament, according to these cultural norms. He didn't speak to them in a foreign language. He used language and ideas that were known to them. And as they developed as a people, as we develop as a people, that communication will change and get more sophisticated. His very, very basic, fundamental view of the world in metaphysics, and goes like this. The one, the center of everything, of course, is God the Father. But we have no conception of that as fallen human being. We know it in word, and we can define terms, but we don't really know it. In our world, it's correspondent with the idea of myth, the meta reality from which all things have to come. This is even the shared meanings even beyond language, the context in which even language developed. And that, of course, has to, like any unity, it has to expand itself. It can't just exist that way. It has to manifest itself in institutions and in ways of life. Otherwise, it's worthless. But that implies a certain becoming. That we're imperfect people. We move from a state of imperfection, hopefully, to perfection. And that's implied in the idea that this unity creates a less perfect manifestation of itself. So that's your first three. It's not meant to be the Trinity in a theological sense, but that's how the human brain works. It's a common argument. Macrocus used it. John of Damascus used it. When you posit God the Father, you have to posit an image. He has to think. He has to think of himself. Well, that thought is also God, and therefore equal to him. You can't get away from that. Any unity has to manifest itself somehow. Our personalities, if we're completely integral, our personalities can't just not act. We were always acting. And that leads to the fourth thing, which is realization. Realization is, remember, the concept of perfection didn't mean that it had no flaws. Perfection normally meant not needing anything outside of it, being completely self-contained. Our vision, as Orthodox people, for example, doesn't require any input from the modern world to make it better. And we use concepts, and we have to use a lot of what it offers, and it's not all bad. But our vision is entirely self-contained. Therefore, it's perfect. We don't need we need no input from anyone else. It's done. It's taken care of. And then the last thing, the lowest, so to speak, the lowest and least perfect aspect of this is expression, and that's the concept of symbol. Symbol is the word that probably the most irritating of English words because it has no bearing at all. It means the opposite of what it meant a few hundred years ago. A symbol is how society manifests its myth. It is not a something without substance. In fact, it's quite the contrary. It's the gateway to substance. It's a way to express something very powerful, that powerfully such that you can't use words. That's why we have poetry, and that's why we have music, because words are weak, and we have certain experiences that only can be expressed that way. I mentioned this concept of intuition, which is this realization that when we focus on anything, any object, any X, most of what we're doing is blocking out everything else, which is a huge amount of work. Our consciousness is confronted by a massive amount of material, no matter what we do. We open our eyes, and we are if we were to analyze it piece by piece, it would never end. The brain has to deal with this, and in our fallen state, it's not just a mechanism. Our own sins and problems and biases also go into filtering this. We have to focus on a few things, and so you consider the intuition, this background stuff, the cosmos, everything, the all. That's what's intuited. We don't have to think about it. It's our immediate connection with the world around us, and that includes ourselves, and it includes our consciousness. In that, the consciousness isn't somehow separated from all this. So the idea of dialectic is to take any object and to expand, and this is what history is. This is what myth does. Over time, objects in our cultural world, and that's really redundant because any object would be cultural by definition. The purpose of our development intellectually is to overcome unknowing, to overcome the idea that we're looking at something, any particular object or set of objects, in an imperfect way, only one little piece of it. We're constantly deepening it. We're constantly connecting it with other things. We start realizing that that any practice, say farming. Farming contains chemistry. It contains economics. It contains meteorology. It contains religion, because we're talking about the final end of these things. Why is it that things grow, and they're constantly striving to realize something that you couldn't possibly predict in a seed? Our own work, order versus chaos, being subject to nature and weather, things like that. Farming, therefore, is this tremendous universal concept. But everything, any practice that we might hold to, when it's viewed, so the point is, you're taking every little bit of that and expanding it and deepening it in every way possible. The deeper that goes, the greater the knowledge, and therefore the greater mastery over the practice. Another way of putting that is that you have now stamped order upon that which is chaotic. The problem I mentioned in terms of debating is that most people are completely unaware of why they believe what they believe, or why they're doing what they're doing. They'll tell you a story. That's a myth in a bad sense, that they're objective thinkers, or that they believe in some ideal that everyone's wonderful. And that's never true, or at least only a tiny part of the truth. All of us have deeply psychological reasons, going back to our past, how we've processed information, things way beyond our control, way beyond what's going on in our subconscious at any given time, how the archetypes in our collective will are always being changed and challenged. Most of the time, we are unaware of the overwhelming majority of the reasons for our motivation and what we do. Everyone knows this, and it's something that it's hard to deal with, because the deeper psychology goes, the more problems we have. Every tiny aspect of consciousness then is continually expanded into more and more questions and more problems. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper and more, almost to the point of infinity. Baruch Spinoza, and as well as Hegel, defined a free action as that action in which we are the exclusive cause. In other words, that we have overcome all of these subconscious causes. We understand them, we put them in their place, and so we act completely in collected. When we say we're calm and collected, this is what we mean. Collected means you're taking all of these other motives, things that drive us. You're taking them out of the subconscious and you're making them conscious. That means we have a mastery over them, we're aware of them, and we can rank them accordingly. The only free action, therefore, is one where you know the entire gamut of causes that have you believe what you believe and therefore do what you do, which is a tremendous amount of work. Therefore, most acts are not free. And people act unfreely because they really truly believe that in doing the wrong thing, they're fulfilling some great purpose. Over time, people start to believe the nonsense they tell themselves. Sin is not the act, a bad act. That's way too juridical. It's the entire personality. It's the entire persona. Sin is an imperfection in how we have organized our own thinking. That we have deliberately left stuff in the subconscious so we don't have to deal with it. Saint Ignatius of Branchanov says that the demonic elements are always in the subconscious. So there they can hide, and they could pretend, or have you pretend that your actions are free when they're not. People who out today play protesting Donald Trump will give you a line that they are in favor of equality. Trump is going to start a nuclear war with Algeria, whatever these idiots think. But that's never true. No one does these things for abstract reasons. There's a whole gamut of motives, some good, some bad, that they're unaware of or don't want to be aware of, that it would take books and books and books to ever analyze. Their actions aren't free. And they're not free partially because they're not based on any truth at all. But they're also not free because they're unaware of why they're doing what they're doing. There was a study about 30 years ago on the Belgian Communist Party, which I didn't know existed until the other day. I read it fairly recently. They were concerned why members joined it. And they spouted all the slogans, but when they got down to it, it was because they really wanted to be a part of something that had a great moral purpose. It had nothing to do with labor, it had nothing to do with dialectics. It had to do with that they loved being a part of something that that gave them a sense of being part of a cause, being a part of something, a movement, making history, that kind of thing. That's really what motivated them. And it's almost like it's really who got to them first, which particular movement got to them first. They loved the idea that they were rebellious, but given the nature of the West, they were not punished for being communists like you would be for being a National Socialist. So it was a cause that made them seem radical, but was not really a sacrifice. It didn't cost them anything. So it really was a perfect thing. Now, they're not going to admit that that's their motives, but it is. You look at a male feminist, and we can go through the list of twisted emotions, these half-baked hormonal things that are going through their system. That's driving them to hate themselves, to wish more punishment on themselves, or what we really read. We know a lot of why these guys are there. They want women to like them. They want to be held in esteem. They want to be one of the girls, and maybe they'll have rewards for them down the road. There's a lot of women who don't trust that, and they shouldn't. So, but getting into their motives would be, would take months of discussion. The point is that nothing they're doing is free, because they only know a tiny speck of what's motivating them, and that's probably not true. In the way we view the world, the image of something is never real. This is something you see in Skovoroda, you see it in Plato. It can't be proven. It's fleeting. An image can never be the basis of anything. You can't have any knowledge of images, except in a negative way. Nominalism, of course, is very opposite of this point of view. And it's rejected for a whole bunch of reasons. One of the main ones is that being is too historical. This myth is the most non-nominalist thing you could possibly ever come up with. Matter and how we generate images from it are completely fluid. I've used the example before, it's very common, that the passionate side of the soul, as Plato talks about, and Losev talks about, can only look at images. It can only deal with colors and contours and fields. That's what the passionate drives are focused on. And that's what motivates it. There's not a man in the history of the world that's ever been aroused by a chemical analysis of the female body, or an abstraction of the female body, or some anatomical, deeply mathematical analysis of the chemicals in a woman's body. That's not what motivates them. No, it's the actual image that they pick up in their senses. Very specific, very vivid. No one has ever been aroused by the concept of a woman. That's a very important thing to realize. That kind of arousal, sexual or otherwise, only exists at the level of images, only exists at the level of non-essential thing. Now, part of what makes a saint is that they actually can see the beauty not in the appearance sense, but they could see beauty in logos, manifest in that person. They've gone beyond being triggered, so to speak, by those curves and everything that we love about women. They go beyond that, and they could see what's real, what most of us can't see when we're confronted with something like that. The truth is, though, that logos is present there. Our reaction are the result of a completely a very complex human nature. We're responding to very specific things. We're not really aware of that because our hormones kick in and we do crazy things. But the important thing is that it's part of this huge complex of how life is created. This force in us that's then part of and connected to everything else in the cosmic order. That's the reality. we get focused on one little aspect of that experience and in our arousal to women, such that everything else gets clouded. And we all know what that's like. Now, the issue is when you, through the ascetic life is meant to slowly erase the purely nominal, specific, image-based perceptions and go far deeper. That body, I don't care how beautiful it is, it's going to die, and it's going to rot, and it's going to be eaten by maggots, and it's going to be disgusting, and it's going to smell. Really, when the mystery's gone with a woman, you lose all that drive anyway. When you see them, in day-to-day life, and you see them sick and everything else, it goes away very, very quickly. It's fleeting. This is why images don't mean anything. It's the lowest level of perception. Unless there's something else there, you have no relationship there. It has to go beyond that. And it has to be far beyond that. And in material objects and how they affect us and how they provoke the will, the intellect has to dominate and say, this is why. We're giving you now a list of causes that's motivating that response to seeing a woman, or seeing anything like that, or seeing a pile of money, or seeing a business opportunity. And you can hardly contain yourself. You got to get in on this before someone else does. Those drives are unfree. What they mean and how they fit into the cosmic order is another matter. Within any mythic construct, which is really a civilization or a society, Losev is also known for his doctrine of names. He did come down on the side of the name-worshipping idea, but his view was very crude and very extreme. I've said many times that name worshippers don't believe that the name of God, Jesus, Yahweh, whatever, is actually God present like it would be in the Eucharist. I think Losev did. And it was very odd because the man is intensely logical, and yet he seems to believe this. But even beyond the theological issues, his doctrine of names is extremely important. Remember, one of the reasons that name worship is being so badly handled is that no one knows what it means. A name or a word is not what we think it is. Most languages see a word as an idea, as a Platonic archetype. We see it as letters on a page. That's what nominalism does to people. It destroys their sense of reality. A word or a name, as terms, refer to everything contained in the conceptual apparatus that we use to describe something. It's not the name of God. That's never been the issue. That's ridiculous. The concept is what the name is, what the word is all of the apparatus intellectually. It could be ritually or it could just be intellectually that we use to describe and understand and love aspects of God's presence. What we know about Him. The entire whether it be the books or the icons or the feelings or the smell, all of that taken together. The concept of an idea, one of the ways that he departed from Plato in that respect, is that he refuses to remove the physical elements from it. The Platonic idea does have matter, because that's very much a part of how we react to, say, a female body is not in and of itself evil, and it should not be excluded from the archetype, because there'd be no babies if that were the case. So he doesn't want to just make this purely ethereal conception. He wants to include the emotional, he wants to include the physical, he wants to include the psychological, and even the irrational, in the sense of not being logical. It could be above or below. A name or a word, when it was used in the ancient world, when it was used in the medievals, even up until 100 years ago, a name was not just a word. Nominalism says that. That's why nominalism is so deadly. No, a name is a complex of emotional, rational, physical things that's symbolized in a name, in the sense that we name ourselves, the name of an object, but equally connected to that is how we describe the object, which is also its name. It's not just one word that we use. It's public. It's known to all. So it has to be communicated. It's not a name in that sense unless everyone knows what it is. It can't be private, your own psychotic world. It has to have, and now this is where it gets tricky, it has to have a communion communicate with its referent. A name that we're talking about just a word. A name we use to describe something has to be connected with that something. It's not just an arbitrary set of sounds. And etymology has a tendency to back us up on this, that separating the words we use and how we verbalize things, the name and the object, is a mistake. It's not arbitrary. These things have the names and descriptions that they have because they're real. He never says that the name and the thing are the same. If that were the case, the description of something would be the something. That's not true. So there's got to be something else. But it has to have an agreement. There has to be, I started off talking about the nature of debate. There has to be a communion there. We have to have a lot in common before we can even begin talking. And we have to understand what we mean. The name, the description, the concepts has to have a direct and immediate connection to the thing that's being described. Otherwise, you become a psychotic. You have created your own private world that no one knows anything about, that completely is nothing more than your projection onto this flux of intuition. It also affirms a purpose. It tells us what it is, what it does. It gives a limit. It gives borders and boundaries. We see the world as discrete objects because we've been trained that way. It's useful to us. Newborn babies probably don't. They see nothing but swirls and images. We have to teach them to pin it down. This is the manifestation of myth. The one, the many becoming, the realization, and then the symbol. Now we're at the level of symbol. And we're also talking about Plato's forms. Losev was primarily a Platonist, and he dealt with Plato most of his career. And he has 5 elements to describe the forms. I found of all the philosophers writing on Plato, Losev has been the most useful in understanding the form. The form the form is absolutely essential to Plato. Without that, he's meaningless. It's the center of all Western thought. It's the center of the spiritual world. Without Plato, nothing happens. Without Plato's forms. A form is a disembodied reality that gives specific objects their defining qualities. So we have a concept of goodness. We also see individually good acts. What all they have, what a bunch of good acts, millions of good acts taken together, what they have in common is goodness. That goodness is real. It's created. It's part of God's mind, and it's the unity that comes before the multiplicity. Otherwise, it's all nonsense. We're arbitrarily saying that things are good without really knowing what we're talking about. We see a lot. We could talk about good acts with philanthropy, intellectually good acts, physically good acts, a good law, a good doctor, a good lawyer. All of these are good. It seems odd because there's a lot of different situations. We're all using the same word. Well, unless there's a concept of goodness that's separate from all of those things, then we're crazy. We're just being lazy. We're calling good could mean anything. Words like love, don't get me started on that. It's used for anything. There has to be a central living entity that exists long before we could start applying it to individual things. The unity has to always come before the thing. Objects don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because there is a creator. There's a unifying world. There's a myth in our social sense. So the first thing that happens is that in Plato's dialogues, there's a manifestation of corruption. Usually it has something to do with words. That someone is talking about. It could be piety, it could be courage, friendship, it doesn't matter. And someone's using it in a self-interested way. They're defining it as they see fit. They're defining it so that they're rationalizing a certain position of power that they may have, for example. And so Socrates points out that what we just said, the concept, there's a separation between the use of the language and the world around it. The language that they're using has no real reference. The language that they're using is kind of custom made for themselves to justify their position. And often they have the power to get other people to think that too. That's why the sophist was such a big problem for him. The words take on a life of their own, which means that not only could you define what goodness is, but you could tell people what a good act is and what it isn't. You could completely redefine their world, if you're that powerful, like the American media has been. There's the idea of the fact. Something is true, but in our social life, something is true only if our terms are defined first. So again, the unity has to come first. We have to know what a swan is before we see a swan, or else we wouldn't know what it is. There's also, the concept, it can't be the same thing. The form has to be separated from the instantation of the form. The form exists prior to it. The unity exists always prior to the aspect. And ultimately, the highest level is number. When Plato or Augustine used the word number, he's not talking about digits. Numbers are icons. Unity, multiplicity, 1 and 2. They're icons of the world. So what we try to do here is give the very, very foundational concepts of what the world is. God creates humans to live in society. To live in society, they have to believe in myths, in the true sense of the word. The myth is the entire cultural complex of everything that we are. And we found in stories and images, it's almost infinite, the amount of material. You have to have all that in common, understand what it means before you could even make a move. Our societies, racially or ethnically, religiously, they have to be deeply unified and homogenous. Because the cultural stories that we have are very delicate. We have to know all the details. We can't have a debate with someone unless we have the same mythic background. You have to have the same goals, have the same reason to have the same goals. We don't have the same goals, or we can't speak the same language, or that there's so many subcultures that no one knows how to talk to each other anymore, or that even reason itself is being disparaged. You don't have a society. And that kind of chaos. Chaos is based on ignorance, as we said. Only the most fanatical, cohesive groups ever dominate, which is why liberalism has always been connected with the so-called emancipation of the Jews. And that's why they have grown admirably in power, because they have maintained their cohesiveness as everything else is falling apart around them. But this kind of falsity, evil acts, this is all based on a lack of knowledge. You don't know what's motivating you. Knowing these motivations is essential to any kind of mental health. You have to know the full gamut of things that have you act, and if you don't know it, you have to refrain from acting until you do. The myth is directly from God. It's directly from Logos. Because human beings can't be human beings without myth. We can't even use the word without this civilizational backdrop. And the institutions and ideas and laws derive from it, including the laws of thought. And all of this implies that we are educated in the true sense of the word from a state of ignorance to a state of knowing. We come to some level of realization, and in the process, we express that development in terms of symbols. That's the foundational concept of the world. It rejects any concept of individuals in the nominalist sense. There's no self-interest there. They're not so naive as to be able to summarize in a few words what motivates people. That's utter nonsense. But part of that symbolism is to be found in the name. And all of this taken together is what we refer to as myth. This is even greater than you always. Heidegger's Dasein always comes up in my mind when I read Losev, but it's even deeper than that. It is the entire it's the entire history of human development. in this huge intuitive almost infinity that we perceive when we confront the cultural world. Now, we can't get it all at once, of course, so we block it out and we focus on a few things. But that's what generates the laws of thought, the laws of what's good and bad, what's real and what is not. We live in an era, of course, where the myth has been shattered and has been replaced by something else. And it's been replaced by things that serve a certain group, and it creates chaos and death and destruction wherever it goes. And the results, among other things, is that discussion, debate, actual community is now increasingly impossible. So thank you for listening. This is the foundation of what we do here. I understand this is very abstract, but I'm an abstract guy, so I think you guys will live. I thank you for listening. My enemies, if you don't understand this, it's because you're stupid. That's why you're my enemies. But otherwise, I thank my supporters. I thank Matt Heimbeck and Matt Parrott, Sven Longshanks, everyone else who's assisted me in this, and I appreciate them very much. And I will talk to you next time. Goodbye.
You've been listening to The Orthodox Nationalist with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson at RadioArian.com.